Hello everyone, Russell Wright from Network Empire and ThemeZoom.com, and I'm making this video for a friend, and then I decided that I would make it for all of my hundreds of students in the Network Empire community because most of us are dealing with the same issues when it comes to becoming decisive in an area called heuristics. If you're not familiar with the terminology of what it means to study choices. Choices are complicated. They're a combination of the solutions in this book are a combination of neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience, heuristics, game theory, and humanistic psychology, and many, many others. This was a book written by Dan and Chip Heath, who literally I consider mentors. And as you're very much aware, their book Made to Stick is a profound book on how to use language and to avoid semantic stretching and where to appropriately use the right kinds of words and stories to impact more deeply your audience, regardless of who that audience might be. So I'm going to quickly, in under 10 minutes, go through the decisive wrap process in a nutshell for those of you who have not had time to read the book. And very specifically, I'm using metaphor and allegory and other kinds of things. In the book, they call WRAP the wrap method. And WRAP is an acronym as well. Okay, and this acronym is designed to help you the moment that you have a difficult or any kind of decision to make to fight against what he calls four villains. And I use the terminology for demons. If you don't like the esoteric terminology, that's fine. Villains or demons the same. The point is that they're negative influences and natural occurring blind spots within the human psyche that prevent you from making decent decisions. Okay, so we're going to start right away with the first problem. The first demon or villain attacks you right at the beginning, as soon as you ask an either-or question. For example, whether or not to. Whenever you find yourself using the whether or not, you are immediately being confronted by the first villain or the first demon. And you immediately need to widen your options. There's almost never a time when whether or not is the only response you could have. Now, sometimes you do have binary decision. That's called binary. That is, when you're flying in a plane and you're about to hit a mountaintop and you're going to crash and it's going to kill everybody on the plane, the closer you get to that mountain cap, to the peak of the mountain or to the ground, the closer you get to having literally a yes or no choice or an either or. Either you pull up or you die. So generally, either or binary questions and solutions and actions are only happening at the moment where the decision needs to be confronted. In nature, that's right during the point of conflict. Okay, so you have a lot of choices, even 45 minutes away from a difficult choice. For example, the Apollo mission. He had an hour to figure out some of the major things that helped the crew survive. So he was still able to use rational thought to come up with good decisions. There was a little bit of luck, but there was also some good decision making. Okay, so don't think that you have to have an either-or answer. Even when you only have 15 minutes to make a decision, you can come up with some pretty good alternatives. So the angel, if you will, that deals with the demon of either-or, okay, is widening your options. Okay, the new angle or position or perspective you can take, angle or angel, is going to be widen your options. Okay, let's go ahead and read what he says here on his chart. Probably be pretty helpful. Narrow framing leads us to overlook options. Okay, teenagers and executives often make whether or not decisions. We need to uncover new options. That's a key word here, is new options. And when possible, consider them simultaneously through multi-tracking. Think and or. Think and, not or. Okay? For example, if somebody had a question of whether or not to keep a baby or not, the closer you get to term, the less your options are going to be viable. The less you're going to have to be and. Okay? So the challenge, sometimes there's major life decisions that are very, very much either or. They seem like either or. Okay, and a lot of the times we don't even include, when we brainstorm, you can use David Allen's brainstorming decision. We don't even include things that we're unwilling to consider. For example, if somebody was deciding whether or not to, if a woman was deciding whether or not to keep a baby, it might never even occur to her to keep a choice and to put it up for adoption because she is morally or ethically imperative. There's just no way that she's emotionally willing to go there. And we're going to address that in the third demon, okay, which is the letter A. Okay, but the point is that most of the time we don't consider multiple options, even in decisions, because they go against some kind of assumption or moral groove that we have. Okay, there's a whole bunch of other options. You know, it could be like keep the baby and move back in with mom and dad, or it could be keep the baby and while moving in a community that's going to help me support that, or. Okay, so the first decision that does have to be made in something like that is whether or not to keep the baby, or whether or not to move to New Jersey for my new job. Typically what's been done is a list of pros and cons, and in this book Chip and Dan make it very clear the flaw in making a list of pros and cons. It actually doesn't work, and it's a very, very powerful book. I strongly recommend that everybody read this book, because you're going to find out that making a list of pros and cons, kind of like a moral algebra, actually is quite detrimental to making decent decisions. Follow the RAP method instead. So where can you find new options? This is the main key. Let's say we're talking about a woman who's thinking about keeping a baby. Where can you find new options? Go to women who've faced that option before and see what they did. See if they had something. Find someone who solved your problem. It's a major, huge thing. We got to be careful with this one, because if, for example, keeping a baby is a very emotional decision, so it's not going to be easy, because what's going to happen is you're going to move on to the second demon or villain, which is going to be dealing with your cognitive bias. Really super emotional decisions like keeping a baby, getting married, whether to stay go to a new job or keep the old one, you're going to need to ladder, and we're going to talk about that. Look for the current bright spots. This is the local talent. And then best practices, regional. Okay. Look at all the women that maybe have kept their babies, but look at all the women who has not kept their babies and find out what they've done and what you're going to come up against. As soon as you do this, you're way ahead of most people. As soon as you widen your options, and by widening your options, you've worked against the demon or the villain of either or binary decisions. That's the biggest problem. As soon as you have this one where you're making a binary reaction decision too quickly before it actually needs to be made, you've hurt your decision making process. Now what's going to happen now is you're going to be working against your bias. Okay, so let's move on to the second demon or villain, which is going to be reality testing your assumptions. That's going to be the angel, or the antithesis of the next thing, which is your cognitive bias. Cognitive bias is a very well-known issue. Take the woman, for example, in our example that is already in this stage of whether or not to keep her baby or not. That's a very normal state for her to be in. Or let's take the woman who is thinking whether or not to take the new job 5 states away, which will change everything in her life. That's actually an example that's used in this book. In assessing our options, what happens now is that the confirmation bias leads us to collect skewed self-serving information. This is a real problem. For example, if you look up here, if I'm a mother trying to decide whether or not I should keep my baby or not, and I'm already emotionally attached to that outcome, and I've already got all kinds of ideas, which most women do, if I find someone who's already solved the problem, if a huge part of me really wants to keep that baby consciously or unconsciously, I'm only going to bring into my space people who decided to keep their baby. I'm not going to talk to people who had abortions. Okay, so what happens is you got to ladder up, and ladder up is some of the best advice they have here. Start with somebody who's right here in your local community, but then go to larger questions about babies and not babies. An example of this was that they gave in the book was trying to deal with, for example, how to speed up the processes in a line at a local elementary cafeteria. You know, it might be that the woman who's taking the kids' money are, in some of, it might be that a school district 20 miles away from you has solved this problem, and the kids only stand in line for 4 minutes, where your kids are standing in line for 30 minutes. And then you go there and you find out what they have done is pre-counted the children's money in advance so they don't stay in line all day. Walmart was very famous for this, the creator of Walmart. He would go all over the world and find out the best practices to speed up the profiteering and the profit-making process. That's how Walmart ended up creating their lines. He first looked at local talent because he found a very, very fast process at a local drugstore, which, by the way, that no longer exists. But he got the original idea. In the original department store, people were going to different departments and paying for unique items at unique registers at those departments. Walmart started the lines happening at the front of the store. Okay, that's an example Sam, the creator of Walmart, going to local talent, but then he went to much larger areas by laddering up. They're talking about going to international levels of solution and problem solving, where he was notorious for going all over the world, not just locally, but all over the world, finding people who've invented, done things better than you. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. Go to people who have solved that problem. However, what you're going to do is you're going to be looking for people who have solved the problem in the way that you want to. And this is why you must reality test your assumptions. That's the next villain you've got to address. So let's go ahead and look at reality testing the assumption, what we really mean here. In assessing our option, our confirmation bias, and that's the real demon that we're looking at, our confirmation bias leads us to collect skewed and self-serving information to combat this bias. Okay, we have to use another angel, the opposite of the villain, the opposite of the demon. Okay, we have to have another angle, a pure perspective. Okay, we can ask disconfirming questions, things that we don't want to ask. What problems does an iPod have? If the woman who's really deeply in love with the idea of having a baby, even when it totally is going to derail her life, she needs to look at both the women who wanted the baby and kept it and those who didn't and had an abortion. If she's got spiritual abortion crisis issues, those are things that she needs to look at. For example, if I'm a religious person that believes that I'm going to go to hell if I have an abortion, it's going to really create a cognitive bias that can change my entire life when I start considering having abortion. In fact, there's a statistical study that shows that women who are completely unwilling to have abortion really will change their religious belief in order to have one if the idea of having one is too scary to them. That's an example of that. Okay. Another thing we can do is zoom out and look for base rates. Okay, and zoom in, seeking more texture. Now, this is more what you'd have to read the book, but whenever possible, we should ooch close to his decision. Okay, ooch means conducting small experiments to teach us more. An example of that would be to a woman who's considering having a baby. She's just got pregnant, and she's not in a position where it's either or. She could still get an abortion, and she goes to a daycare center to handle a lot of children, or she goes to her friend's house who has babies to take care of them. She interviews a lot of people who kept the baby and a lot of people that didn't get it, and starts to find out the pros and cons of their life. Okay, so this is way complicated of a process if you don't honestly assess your own cognitive biases and you're not willing to admit what you want. Okay, and that's why I recommend that you read the book, because there's many aspects to this that you could fail on. Reality testing the assumption is probably the hardest one. Okay, as well, actually they're all very hard. The next demon or villain. Okay, since we know that cognitive bias, being biased towards attracting and ascertaining and bringing information in that confirms what you either consciously or unconsciously want to be true, is attaining emotional distance. But villain 3 is short-term emotion, being swayed. Short-term emotion evolved over many millions of years so that we can make split decisions. This is the essence of many people's works, including Antonio Damasio, The Feeling of What Happens. If you get seriously into the neurosciences, you'll find that emotion was designed to hypercharge or hyperboost that moment in time where we have to make a split decision, an either-or decision. Okay, where it's too late for us to widen our options. We need to have enough anger, rage, emotion, laughter, humor, whatever, to make us choose. Okay, emotions, especially fear, are designed to help us make a quick decision with the best information possible, so that we don't have a false positive. A false negative. We err on the side of positive. In other words, that rustling in the bush is probably a lion, and that's why we're willing to believe so many things. Is because we almost always default to making the assumption, because the neuroeconomics of being wrong is a Darwin Award. Okay, so what happens is we're unable to take emotional distance. Relationships is the big one for this, because we need each other for survival, and one of the biggest human fears is abandonment, and moms have that in a big way. Okay, we're wired to have it for millions of years, because honestly, it did mean death when our mate did not stick with us when we had a child. We have all these things. It's a hugely emotional charge, and for example, for a mother trying to make a decision, it's almost impossible for her to disassociate emotionally, and her hormones, her neurons, everything are telling her that it's time to reproduce. It goes so deep into her biology that the idea of not having a baby it's sometimes hard for her to be clear. Other mothers just know that they're not ready, and they don't do that. So attaining some distance before deciding emotionally is also a very powerful mechanism used in the book when it describes a woman who really is offered what appears to be a better job offer far away, but her lifestyle is compromised. And it's an amazing process that they have there to go through weighing your life style with more money. Okay, so short-term emotion tempts us to make choices that are bad in the long term. To avoid that, we need to attain distance by shifting our perspective. What would I tell my best friend to do? This is a really, really important. Because a lot of the times, let's do as I say, not what I would do. What would I tell my best friend to do? Well, I'm telling all of my friends right now to go through the RAP method, okay, before they make any decision that's major or life-altering. Because I know that it works. It's worked for me, and it's actually increased my financial abundance and many, many other things. And it's also able to make really super rational decisions. Let me give you an example of that. You know how when you're fighting with a boyfriend or girlfriend and both of you are afraid to walk away, okay, and that actually comes from an ancient abandonment issue. If you guys both know the science behind why better decisions are made when you attain emotional distance, just the recognition, this is called cognitive reassessment in the neurosciences, just the ability to make the admission that this is a rule and that this is clinically proven to help both of you not react. When you walk away as a safe ground rather than a punishment, you're able to get some emotional distance to make better decisions. Then it doesn't add to the fire. You know what I'm talking about. Everybody who's ever gotten into a fight, it's like you sit around and you just stay there afraid to leave because you're afraid of losing each other, or one of you is afraid. That's when you get clingy. All of us have that tendency. But when you know that you must attain emotional distance, you just leave, and it doesn't have to be a threat or a punishment that's happening. This is just one of many, many, many tips in the book that you need to be aware of. What would my successor do is a good one. Intel is only around today because they attained emotional distance. It was very hard for them to do. What would my successor do? Literally, the two guys at the top who had literally built the entire company on building processors and memory. The idea of moving over to a whole different type of business was incredibly hard for them. They had to let go of everything that they knew. Had they not, they would not be around today. They were literally, truly able to become objective. I think most of us are, it's almost impossible for us to become objective. So what you've done here is, if you get rid of this villain, okay, which is either or, the villain of binary decisions, whether or not to keep the baby or not, okay, or whether or not to move to, there's other options, whether or not to move to New Jersey or not for this new job. Can I do this job on Skype? Can I live there part of the year? You see what I mean? When you're dealing with something like a baby, it's a little bit more radical because it's like whether or not to create co-parenting and have the baby. Okay, yeah, you still need to decide to have the baby one way or the other, but start widening your options about what the baby could mean. Okay, reality test your assumptions. Okay, stop. Be careful you're not pulling in people who are telling you what you want to hear. Okay, if the guy is really ready, really doesn't want a baby, it's pretty obvious he's going to pull in all the people that tell him that you must be nuts for having a baby. Okay. This is the serious problem with cognitive bias. The woman who really wants it and the husband doesn't is going to pull in all kinds of justifications from her girlfriends who've had babies. And it's statistically shown that she's going to talk 90% of the time to women who've chosen to keep their babies if she wants it. Okay, do both in equal portion. Attaining distance is if everybody's freaking out and you're talking to your girlfriend or boyfriend about keeping the baby or moving to another state for a job. As soon as you blow up because your agenda, you're reacting based on what you want, take some space. Go move in with somebody else for a while, or if it's possible, or at least take major breaks or hikes. Men, go to your men's groups, women, go to your women's groups, but don't use it to gang up on each other. Actually use it to truly make better emotional decisions, being aware of the four demons. Now, where it gets interesting is villain number 4. This is one that I'm working on the most. It's overconfidence. That demon is overconfidence. There's a lot of hugely overconfident tripwires that you can set. David Lee Roth, for example, there's huge rumors about him from Van Halen. He was apparently hell to work with, and people described this kind of prima donna behavior, specifically the one where in the contract he said there needs to be a bowl of M&Ms in David Lee Roth's dressing room with absolutely no brown M&Ms. If there was a single brown M&M, the whole organization or city or Coliseum was charged a $10,000 extra contract fee. The reason he did that, it was actually a tripwire to make sure that the people who set up his pyrotechnics, which was very dangerous, he had an extremely dangerous set. That was a tripwire. If they can't manage to pull the brown M&Ms out of the bowl, he figured that they probably weren't meticulous enough to be able to set up massive explosives on stage. He's a very interesting man. He's really, really good at heuristics, actually. But there's all kinds of other things in here about preparing to be wrong. There's a lot of examples about decisions that were made by men who were pathologically certain and who were wrong. Okay? There's several examples of this, like the Beatles, for example. The record label that hired the Beatles, that heard the Beatles first, had an opportunity to sign them. And the owner of the record label, which I can't remember his name, or the label, is very good, basically said, sorry, boy bands with guitars are dead. They're going out. And he was absolutely certain at the time, even though there was some evidence that was contrary. And so he lost a $1 billion contract, essentially, which became one of the most popular bands in history, the Beatles. So these are like, if he had gone through the four processes here and used the four angels of decision making to cancel out the four villains or demons of decision making, he may have actually reconsidered whether or not he should sign the Beatles. Okay, so this is an example of what it is that we're really looking here. We are overconfident, thinking we know how the future will unfold. Okay, this is especially dangerous for people who go to psychics, cold callers, or anything like this. It's been proven that almost we forget we notice our wins, but we forget our losses, and we do this intentionally because we want to use heuristics and decision-making processes that are more intuitive. But we should prepare for bad outcomes as well as good ones, and we should reconsider our decisions. We can set tripwires. Tripwires again, like David Lee Roth's no brown M&Ms. Tripwires are very important. I can't get into them here, but the reason they're important is because you should remind yourself when things aren't happening. Tripwires can actually be life tripwires. If the company that I started hasn't made $1 million in 3 years, and I've lost my original vision and passion, and I can't even remember what the hell I was doing but starting this company, I'm going to set my Google Calendar alert to remind me 2 years from now that I need to reassess my entire life and start looking for other work. I have all kinds of tripwires in my business. Okay, if I haven't been back to Kauai in a certain amount of time, then I need to go no matter what. And I'm putting money into this account, for example. If I keep telling myself excuses and those excuses stretch further and further, then I need to create a tripwire to reassess everything. And sometimes you just got to drop everything and go, just call it. These are the types of things. Tripwires are so important in life. Okay, so let's just take a quick overview. I'm going to summarize these for you because I strongly recommend that you read the book. There has never been a book or anything that these boys have written that haven't changed my life. I really have to tell you that. You can also look at brandtostick.com, where I have their diagram on how to tell a story. Okay, so one last time, and then we're going to close. I promise I'll wrap this up because I really want you to get this. The first demon is either or. Whenever you heal yourself, either or. I need to keep the baby. Do I keep the baby or get rid of the baby? Okay. Do I keep the baby or have an abort? Whether or not to keep the baby or not. Whether or not, get rid of that. Spend some time considering your options. For example, options you can keep it and. Okay. Another decision is I don't have to decide right now. I can wait for 3 weeks to go through these other options. Okay, before I do so. Another one is I can go on a retreat and reassess my life. But in other words, give yourself some space to go through the other options before you just get stuck in whether or not to keep the baby. Either or. All right? Bypass that for a second and go into reality, test your assumptions, attain distance before deciding on prayer to be wrong. For example, you might attain some distance on a retreat or something, or go for a hike or go for a vision quest, and reality test your assumptions and prepare to be wrong and these different types of things. You might take some time to reassess your life. So the demon, the villain, is whether or not, either or. The angel is create more options. And you'll be surprised how many things have many, many, many options besides whether or not, either or. And I haven't given a ton of examples. Whether or not to buy this car or not. It has a million different possible answers. I could wait. I could put it I could have my company buy it. There's so many other ways to widen your option. And then, before you make that choice, stop finding self-confirming evidence. Write down when you know you have a bias one way. Write it down and work around it. And you have to consciously work against this to you might even have to talk to people who have a distasteful solution for you, like we discussed. Okay, work against that by equally questioning people who have solved the problem both ways. Okay, even if you don't like the way they did it. Abortion, for example, being one. People don't, if I'm a woman and I don't like abortion and I'm a Christian and I feel like I'm going to hell, that might be a major process, but it's still the process. Okay? Reassess your assumptions. Talk to more people. Expand your mind. Attain distance before deciding. Super important. Okay, if you're still struggling with these two, take off. Get away from the source of the contention. An example of this is a book written by the Millionaire Teacher. He knew that he was always emotionally persuaded by car salesmen, so he actually created a process where he never had to go onto the lot. He would only call them and say, if you ever have a car of this kind, this kind, this kind that is $5,000 or less, call me back. On the car lot, they always talked him up to $9,000 or greater. But when he started calling in and never putting himself in the context of that, he started making better decisions. This is kind of like in 12-step when they tell you not to go into a bar. You're very, very likely to not make the best decision of your life if you're still emotionally tied to alcohol. Okay? You might be able to, but why put yourself in that situation? Keep yourself distant from the source of your emotional intensity. Okay? Enough to look at these other angels. Okay? And then finally, prepare to be wrong. Ask yourself, okay, I've made a decision. Am I being overly certain? Okay, and if you are, think about, have some oversight. If I was wrong about this, I've got a plan C. If I was right about this, I have a plan B. Now, things like having a baby and dying, those are major decisions. If you have a cancer, for example, it's a major decisions. There might not be oversight. You do have to decide whether you're going to have the baby or not at some point. But you can do these other things first. And then if you decide to have the baby, you might find out that you're wrong about how bad or good it was in your life. In fact, a lot of authors have proven, especially Dan Gilbert from Stumbling Upon Happiness, that a lot of the things that you think are going to be horrible end up changing your life through a process called synthetic happiness. But you do lose a lot of control once certain choices are made, so have some oversight. If you decide to get a divorce or not have a baby, for example, you might prepare for the repercussions of that well in advance before you start communicating it with everybody else. Because when you make a decision, you affect everyone else. And the rest of your family or your spouse or your girlfriend might not agree with that decision, but you still need to be able to make these decisions freely. Take responsibility for the things that have occurred, but you still have to be true to your own self. When you go through the RAP method, when you're done, if you still have a strong sense that you're not making a great decision, okay, then I recommend that you go ahead and read the entire book. Just take time out, attain some emotional distance, and read the entire Decisive book, especially the chapter where it deals with very, very major life decisions like having a baby or moving your whole life to another place. Then come back, and before you start deciding and telling your spouse, your friends, your family what you've decided, get really, really clear. Okay, because then there's going to be more emotions, and they're not going to want you to have an emotional distance. They're going to get very emotional when you make a decision they don't agree with, and you can't afford to care at that point. You need to decide, okay, because you will be swayed by the people in your life emotionally. That's part of it. But once you've made that decision, stick to your guns, because chances are the only reason you're deciding is because of the emotional impact on everyone else. Now, I'm not telling you to not be an empath. I'm not telling you to make non-empathetic decisions. I'm telling you to recognize when you're being influenced emotionally and not rationally. It's the hardest thing for human beings to do. Okay, and this is for every business decision, you guys, that you do. I've made 10,000 times better decisions when I do a RAP method every time. Even just recognizing that I'm in an either-or situation, that I believe that I have to do this or this rather than I could do this, and this, and deciding from those. Okay? All right. I hope this is helpful. Russell Wright from networkempire.com. May all of you be incredibly effective and decisive, regardless of how intense or emotionally uncertain the decision is that you need to make. I'll see you on the inside.